Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar around the retail revolution and looking at how you can accelerate your digital transformation with DevSecOps. My name is James Marcham. I look after the majority of our retail customers at GitLab in the UK. I'm joined by Beatrice Barbosa, one of our solutions architects who also works with our retail customers, and Brian Ross, one of our field CTOs. We've got a fairly packed agenda, which we're going to run through over the next 30 minutes. And we're going to kick off with Beatrice running us through the retail landscape, the challenges our customers are typically seeing, and some of the opportunities that presents to them. Brian's going to talk through the strategic advantage retail customers can get by looking at a DevSecOps platform approach. And then Beatrice is going to run through some of our real-world customers and what they're doing with GitLab. Then we'll wrap up just by talking about, look, what are some of the next steps you can do? How can you actually use some of the things that we've spoken about today? If anyone has any questions during the call, please put them in the chat and we will try our best to respond. And if not, we'll follow up with you afterwards if we run out of time. So look, I'll hand over to Beatrice.
Hey everyone. So we're going to start by looking at the retail landscape. So some of the trends and challenges and opportunities as well that we've seen. So we start with the digital first consumer expectation. So what we see is that customers expect this consistent, efficient, and personalized experience across multiple channels. So be desktop, application, in-store, all with integrated payment solutions. So that takes a bit to manage all these different channels and maintaining a consistent experience. And then we also see a lot of economic pressures. So there's inflation, rising labor and operational costs. And at the same time, so that's the challenge that retail companies have. Then at the same time, consumers still expect quality and competitive pricing. So retailers have to find a balance when in that still being efficient, provide quality, loyalty schemes, all of that without compromising the customer experience. And then we see the security challenges. So we've seen recently here in the UK a lot of an increase in cyber attacks. And we also see across the UK and EU and across the globe really an increase in compliance requirements that all organizations have to comply with. And that's kind of the consequence of the digital transformation that has happened and that is happening in retail. There's an increased exposure to cyber risk. So there's more threats of data breaches and ransomware attacks. And that leads to an increase in compliance requirements around data processing and more audits and more complex auditing processes of your software. And then there's speed to market. So here is about being able to launch new products quickly and being competitive, staying competitive. So we have seasonal launches, we have Black Friday, Christmas, all these sorts of events, and also a lot of competitive pressure to staying competitive. And this requires operational speed and agility. So retailers must be able to roll out new campaigns and products faster than before so that they can be able to respond at this speed and to consumer requirements. And finally, we have an increased supply chain complexity because there's multiple vendors and multiple platforms, local and global, and retailers have to manage all of that, and that requires reliable technology platforms to make sure operations stay streamlined. And so that successful integration of the different vendors and across the globe and local is also tied to customer satisfaction and is seen as a competitive advantage for retailers. And I'll pass on to Brian.
Thank you. So we live in an interesting time, right? Where although we know more about security than we ever have, and we have more tools to help us find vulnerabilities and fix them, we're still in a position where we have vulnerabilities happening on a regular basis. And the average cost of a data breach within the retail sector is about £2.5 million or €3 million. And this is from the IBM Cost of a Data Breach report. So this is based on real data breaches from across the globe, all compiled by IBM. For me, the most worrying thing, though, isn't that 2.5 million. It's the 241 days that it takes us to identify and contain a data breach once it's happened. And remember, that's the average time. That's not the maximum or the minimum, that's the average. So we're going to see some companies that may take over a year to find a data breach and to try and contain that. So what can we do about it, first of all? Well, I think we need to understand where the problems are coming from. And traditionally, we always think about our production environments and about hackers breaking into those. But in reality, over the last couple of years, we've seen a dramatic change in how attackers will look to penetrate our environments. First and foremost, we're seeing a lot more targeting of developers. So a developer workstation is a goldmine to hackers. It will have SSH access keys, it will have API token keys, and other credentials that if an attacker can get into that machine, they're able to use that to break into other systems. We saw this used very recently with the Node.js problem with NPMs, whereby an attacker was able to break into some piece of software. Once it got into a developer's workstation, it looked for other credentials and then poisoned any repos that person had been using. So the attack spreads like a worm through all the developers in NPM, and as a result, we've seen thousands of repos that have been affected by that. There's many other examples as well where it's been the supply chain that's been the problem. And that can be just as a result of not understanding how many dependencies our software has. Again, picking on Node.js for a little bit, the average number of transitive dependencies, so in other words, dependencies and dependencies over dependencies, is about 1,000 in an average Node.js project. Tracking all that is incredibly difficult. And keeping up to date with all of the vulnerabilities that might exist in those dependencies is where we see customers really struggle. And again, there's been recent examples there with XZutils, where there was an attacker over a long period of time managed to get trusted by the project, an open source project, and then embed some malicious code, which was thankfully found quite quickly. We've seen it in the corporate world as well, where that supply chain attack is much more deliberate, where it's going directly into the build pipeline of an organization, and in the form of like SolarWinds, where the build servers were compromised, malicious code was compiled, signed with legitimate certificates, and built into the production release. And there was actually a customer that ended up finding that problem. And of course, finally, we've got the complexity that Beatrice was talking about, whereby installing and running software is getting harder and harder each day. So even if we've managed to secure all of our supply pipelines and chains and etc., we might find that we've got S3 buckets, APIs, or databases which are exposed to the internet accidentally, either through missing authentication or perhaps just the access control hasn't been all the way thought through. So in retail and some of the other sectors, we're seeing that regulation is changing. And it's a bit of a tipping point, I think. There's more interest in how software is made, in other words, the supply chain that's behind it, rather than just assessing its security at a point in time, like during a penetration test, etc. So we're seeing NIS2, DORA, and a few of the others really focus on a move towards continuous assessment. So at any point, an auditor should be able to come in and assess how secure you're building software on that day, right at that point. And I think for many organizations, the challenge then is that building software requires a village. It's not just about developers, it's about security engineers, it's about platform engineers, it's about all of the people that we need to come together to build the best software. And to use this analogy of a rowing boat, we can all be individually tremendous athletes, but unless we're able to paddle at the right speed, the right intensity, with the right rhythm, we're not going to be going in the direction we want to. We're just going to be going in circles, right? And I think that software is the exact same. So how does GitLab help? Well, for us, we look at vulnerability assessments and scanning throughout our entire process. So we've embedded this into the process so that you've got scanning on every commit into the code. So the scanners will be running on every CI pipeline run. We've got the ability to give developers that feedback directly. So they're not waiting on a production release to find out there's bugs. They're finding them straight away as part of their build, and they can look at those in the IDE and fix them. And then, of course, we've got a sensible kind of review process where changes can be carefully assessed and reviewed before it's allowed to move on to other environments, like your production environment. Built into GitLab is all sorts of security scanners. So we have things like secret detection, which is, protecting us from those small mistakes like exposing an API token or an S3 Amazon credential into our code, and we can stop that before it hits any kind of repos. We have dependency analysis, which will look for all of those transitive dependencies throughout your project, analyzing the security and working out whether you need to be applying any updates. And of course, there's static analysis tools and dynamic tools to look at the code that you have and try and find vulnerabilities in that code. Not just in terms of known vulnerabilities, but also pure coding practice like SQL injection or other forms of bypass. And of course, being GitLab, we are a platform. So if our tools are not what you want to use, of course, you've got the option of bringing your own, integrating them into your pipeline, and building that as part of your vulnerability assessments. So I won't go through the full set of GitLab features. We'll be here literally all day. Instead, I just want to highlight a couple of things that catch customers out on a regular basis. From a policy management perspective, I think the things that we need to focus on getting right are group structure. So defining an org structure within GitLab as a piece of software so you can separate business units, data classifications, and the different applications you have. And if you do that properly, that means you can assign roles automatically from AD or LDAP. And it also means we can apply compliance policies that can be attached to those groups such that certain types of software or certain classifications of data need to go through additional checks that are enforced as part of the pipeline. So if it's an internal build, maybe we allow some vulnerabilities within the dependency checks, where if it's production, maybe we block anything that is above medium. Likewise, from a workflow perspective, I think the key thing really is around separation of duties. So thinking about part of this boat that we have with all of our athletes, who in our organization should be allowed to do things? So is it security teams that are defining policies? Is it platform teams that are setting the controls? So the guardrails that protect us from releasing poor quality coded production? And how much autonomy should developers have in tailoring those guardrails to their particular project or their particular set of tools? Ideally, what we want to do is build reusable components and build a framework of policies that give developers the right level of autonomy while still retaining oversight and control. And that's the thing with all of this, right? If we were thinking about a food analogy, we can have developers making variations of of a soup recipe, but the basic food safety standards are always there, non-negotiable and automated as part of what we do. So when a regulator comes and asks us, how do we ensure compliance? We're not showing them each and every can of soup that we're producing or each and every application. We're able to show them how our factory works, how we're building software, and how we can guarantee that everything is safe built in from day one. And then finally, that audit piece is obviously very important. This is what we're trying to get to, right? Is that rather than stitching together audit logs from 15 different tools, wouldn't it be nice if we had comprehensive, consistent evidence built from our single source of truth, which is this pipeline of software builds, so we can gather all of that evidence as part of every single build, cryptographically sign that, and have it available whenever an auditor wants to see what's happened, or we want to backtrace to work out when a change was applied, how it was done, and we can have confidence in that system hasn't been tampered with. So of course, you don't need to take just our word for it. GitLab, we're very proud that we've been featured by Gartner in the Magic Quadrants for both DevOps platforms and AI code assistants. There's also a new range of these Magic Quadrants that have just been released, so you'll see us in the top right-hand corner of those as well. And of course, from a customer perspective, we've got 30 million users on our GitLab platform. We've got more than 50% of Fortune 100 companies are GitLab customers, as well as a huge range of retail outlets that are using GitLab on a day-to-day basis to build better software faster. I'll hand you back to Beatrice. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian. All right, so now what we're going to look at is a few examples of some of our customers and how they've implemented some of the things that Brian has talked about. So the first customer is just trying to get it. Okay, now there we go. Right, so the first use case is security first development and shifting left. So looking at the security scanners that Brian mentioned. So this is the example of the Nelm. So the Nelm, for some of their security and compliance requirements, they wanted to have automated SAST and DAST. So static application security testing, they will check for source code vulnerabilities in the code, and DAST, the dynamically testing web application for vulnerabilities. So they wanted to have that automatically within the pipelines. And so they did that with using GitLab, where you can have these tests and all the others. So I'm not just going to go through I'm not going to go through the security scanners because Brian already did that. But you could have all these security scanners embedded in the pipelines. So anytime a developer pushes code in the merge request, you'll be able to see all the results. And the value in that is that it shifts security left, right? So earlier in the development lifecycle, so at the merge request stage, a developer can see, view, and fix vulnerabilities right away rather than waiting for a later stage. And that way you also make sure that as an organization, you are still meeting all your security requirements. So I'm just going to show some examples of what that looks like in GitLab using just a demo application example. So you'll see we have here a pipeline, we have all the jobs, and what you see is in the test stage, we see all the different scanners. So some of them, like Brian said, you could integrate third-party scanners if you'd like, but you also have the GitLab scanners, and you'll see they are automatically running whenever code is pushed to the merge request. And then from the merge request perspective, this is what it looks like. So developer is able to see, if we see the first box on license compliance, then on the right-hand side at the top, you see the licenses that were detected with these new code changes, and that it detected a license that is out of compliance. So that's something that the developer immediately has visibility over. And then in the bottom box, you'll see all the results from the security scanning and all the 47 new potential vulnerabilities that were introduced. And then a developer can look at that on the right-hand side and click on each of them, see what the vulnerability is and how to fix that vulnerability, and do that right away when they still have context of the code that has been pushed, which is a lot more efficient because it's much faster. So it's efficient, but it also reduces risk in the long term as it reduces the exposure to cyber attacks. And the good thing is it's all in a central place. It's all in the merge request. Any team, developers, operations security, they can look at that and see what's going on whenever code is pushed. And that's because the scanners were automatically embedded into the pipelines. Then the next example is more looking at meeting compliance requirements and automating how you can meet compliance requirements. So this is an example of another retailer, Bol, that's based in the Netherlands. And what they're struggling with was with meeting existing compliance requirements, but also the fact, like I talked about earlier, that there's always new compliance requirements being introduced given the increase in cyber risk that retail organizations are exposed to. So it's not just about meeting them today, but also as you go through, easily maintain how we're meeting compliance requirements and tracking that across all our software applications. And there's a few that they were looking at, like GDPR and data protection. So automating those checks, then within the pipelines, making sure they're handling customer personal data securely, having an audit trail for all the changes that are being made so they can use that for auditing. And then from payment, a few of the requirements are also listed here that they had to comply with. So they use GitLab's compliance frameworks to achieve that. And let's just look at what that looks like. So with GitLab, we have the compliance center, and this is where you can define all your compliance frameworks. So I have an example here of the ISO 27001. And then next to it, we have all the requirements that are associated with that specific framework. So this is how you can define, and how Paul did that, how you can define, these are the frameworks that our organization must comply with. So I create them, and then I create all the requirements that allow me to, that are associated with that framework and that I need to comply with. And then within the compliance center, I am able to see across all my applications if I'm meeting those requirements or not. So you'll see in the top screenshot, you'll see what project, you see the different bars, and one bar shows what projects are covered by the frameworks and what projects are not covered by the frameworks. So right there, you'll be able to see as an organization, are my software applications complying with the frameworks that we as an organization have to comply with. And then in the bottom screenshot, you'll see for the requirements that are associated with those frameworks. So for example, we have here, oh, I wanted to go back. Yeah, so for example, we have here secure coding or access to source code. So any of those requirements, then I can see which of those have failed, which of those have passed, as well as the control that I have implemented, as well as what frameworks need attention. So this is a central place that allows an organization to see how, as an organization, we're complying with security requirements. Because what we find is that shifting left, and that's something that we got from the use case with Paul, shifting left without giving teams the right tools is not necessarily efficient. And so having a central place where we can manage all of that and effectively shift left is what's going to save our teams a lot of time, save developers a lot of hours across their day. Then the last use case that I'm going to talk about is how you can enable that at scale. So this is another customer example that we have. And I'm just going to go through how it was before, what they did, and what the result was. So the situation was a customer that was using a third-party tool, but had very little adoption of that tool across their application. So a third-party tool to scan their software for vulnerabilities. And at the same time, because of the lack of adoption, they also didn't have much visibility over what the risk was and what was actually being remediated by the different teams that were using it. And so then security was seen as a blocker to fast development because it was not being adopted and it was not enabling faster development. So some of the risks that come with that situation, which is a situation that we see very often, is that there's cyber attacks and fines, which is what we've seen recently, which also damage not just the fines, but also damages the brand reputation. And then there's no risk mitigation strategy because even where the scanners were being run, the vulnerabilities are not being fixed. So there's little value in having scanners run if the vulnerabilities are not being fixed, you're not actually reducing risk. And so then that created an unsatisfying trade-off because it was security and compliance versus speed. They couldn't just work together and be secure and compliance, but also fast to respond to market trends. And there was no traceability and uncertainty, like I mentioned. It was not very clear who changed what, so that really complicates it when you have to go through auditing processes. And yeah, because they were not able to know who was doing what and if it was being done early enough. So what was the solution? The solution here was to use GitLab security policies to enable the scanners at scale. So when they were enabled at the top level of the organization, they were inherited to all the projects that needed to comply with those policies. So in this case, we talked about the pipeline execution policy, and I'll show an example very briefly. So this is a standard CI/CD file where you can define all the jobs that you need to run. It can be security scanners, it can be third-party security scanners, or any other sort of jobs that you need to run to stay compliant. And that is injected into the existing pipeline of your teams. So that's what enables it first. It's enabled at scale. It's a single pipeline, easy to maintain over time. But also, yeah, so that's what I was trying to say, sorry. And then, so what was the result? The result was that, like I was saying, it's easy to maintain because it's a reusable piece of a pipeline, and that reduces the configuration effort for AppSec teams. So whenever there's new requirements, it's easy to just adjust that single pipeline to all the new compliance requirements that exist. But also it improves the developer experience, because now the developers only need to worry about writing code and fixing the vulnerabilities rather than configuring all these compliance and security requirements, because that's being configured by them at the top level of the organization and just automatically injected into their pipelines, and they'll just worry about seeing the results. But then for the security and compliance team, there's also benefits in terms of visibility and simplifying the auditing processes, because now they can see what risk exists and what is the remediation strategy that's being implemented. And then when it comes to auditing, it's easier because there's an audit trail of everything that's being changed. And so that's the example. Let's look at what that looks like in like the example that I'm talking about. So the pipeline execution policy will rely on these, what we call the golden pipeline. So this is just a set of jobs that you've defined that you need to run to comply with whatever regulatory requirements you have. And then that's being done in a separate project, like I said, at the top level of your organization. So it's in a separate project from the development projects. And that's what allows for separation of duties and segregation of duties, because then a developer or someone that's just working on the projects won't have access to be able to override the compliance jobs that have been defined at the higher level. But the team that has access to it will still be able to adjust it whenever needed. So what that looked like before, you'd have, so in my project, I'll have these different jobs that I'm running specific for my project. And now as that's being injected from the top level, the additional jobs for security and compliance purposes, now you'll see I have all these additional jobs that have been run automatically. So again, this is embedding, like building on the other use cases that we talked about. Again, this is embedding additional compliance and security requirements into my pipelines automatically, without me as a developer having to do much of the configuration itself. And then just to summarize on all these use cases, on what that means to you in terms of benefits. So first, this kind of project structure where we have the different projects to define the central governance piece and the standard pipeline piece allows for separation of duties, which is a very common requirement for a lot of regulations. And then this is a standard pipeline, which reduces risk because it's standard. It can be applied across the whole organization, and it's standard to the whole organization. Then it's central. So whenever there's new regulations, very easy to just adjust that to the new regulation that come in, rather than being all over the place trying to understand what's complying and what's not. And then it lets you meet regulatory needs from a single place. So when we think of the compliance center and how we have visibility over across the whole organization, how are we complying with all the regulatory requirements that we are subject to? And I'll pass to James.
Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you, Brian. So look, we're nearly at time. I think just to summarize what we've spoken about, we recognize that the threat landscape retailers are facing is getting bigger and harder to deal with. And hopefully we've started to show you a little bit around how GitLab can help you address that in a simple and scalable way, but without impacting the pace of development and innovation. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what we suggest doing next, and how we can help you with that. So I think firstly, look to build your strategic vision. So where do you want to get to? Not what do you think you can achieve over the next 2 to 3 months, but what's your North Star? Where would you like to be? What's your target operating model? Once you've identified that internally, and we recommend collaborating with the different teams internally to build that, people like Brian or other people within our field CTO team can help you to build a plan on how to get there and look at what those milestones are. We also recommend looking for some tactical wins, so some low-hanging fruit, something that demonstrates some immediate value to help you get some momentum around this type of thing. If you're a GitLab customer, that might be as simple as enabling security scans in your pipelines. If you're not a GitLab customer, maybe that's consolidating some of your tooling onto a single SCM or CI platform. And then really to really drive the traction. Try and find your innovators internally. So the teams or the individuals who will act as change agents. So these are the people that can, embrace change. They'll help you to share the vision across the organization, and they'll share their success and help to bring other people along on the journey. So that's all we had. We're exactly at time. So thank you very much for everyone that joined. Sorry for any questions we didn't get to. We will follow up afterwards, and we'll share a copy of the slides to everyone that joined. Thank you very much.